Cortisol belly has become one of the most searched wellness phrases of the last couple years, usually attached to a video of someone pointing at their midsection and blaming stress for weight that diet and exercise alone haven't touched. The claim is everywhere, but the actual science behind it is more nuanced than most of the content repeating it. Let's break down what cortisol actually does in your body, whether the stress belly fat connection is real or oversimplified, what the research genuinely supports, and what actually helps if chronic stress is part of your weight picture. Cortisol is a hormone produced by your adrenal glands, and it's often labeled the stress hormone. But that's a bit of an oversimplification. Cortisol follows a natural daily rhythm, peaking shortly after you wake up to help mobilize energy for the day, and gradually declining toward evening. It plays a role in regulating blood sugar, blood pressure, inflammation, and how your body metabolizes fat, protein, and carbohydrates. Under acute stress, a job interview, a near miss in traffic, an intense workout, cortisol spikes temporarily as part of the fight or flight response. This short-term response isn't the problem. The concern researchers actually study is chronic, sustained elevation of cortisol over weeks and months, which is a different physiological situation than a normal daily spike. The biological reasoning behind the cortisol belly fat claim isn't invented. Visceral fat, the fat stored around your abdominal organs rather than just under the skin, has a higher density of cortisol receptors compared to fat stored elsewhere on the body. This means visceral fat tissue is more responsive to cortisol signaling than fat in other areas. Research has found associations between chronically elevated cortisol and increased visceral fat, and this pattern shows up most clearly in people with genuinely pathological cortisol elevation, such as those with Cushing's syndrome, a medical condition involving significantly elevated cortisol levels. So is cortisol belly fat a real medical diagnosis? No. It's a popularized description of a plausible physiological mechanism, not a distinct medical condition you either have or don't have. For most people without a diagnosed cortisol disorder, belly fat is still primarily driven by the same fundamentals that drive fat storage everywhere else: a sustained calorie surplus, genetics, age-related changes in fat distribution, and activity level. Chronic stress can be a contributing factor layered on top of those fundamentals, but it's rarely the sole cause. What does the research actually show? Several studies have found associations between higher cortisol levels and greater abdominal fat, particularly in people already dealing with chronic stress or sleep disruption. At the same time, the research is largely correlational rather than definitively causal. Chronic stress also drives other behaviors that independently promote weight gain: poor sleep, increased cravings, reduced motivation to exercise. So untangling cortisol's direct effect from these indirect pathways is genuinely difficult. The honest summary is that the mechanism is real, but the popular framing of cortisol as a standalone explanation overstates what the evidence supports for most people. There's no test that definitively separates stress belly fat from any other kind, but a few patterns are worth watching. If you've noticed abdominal weight gain during a period of unusually high, sustained stress without major diet or activity changes, stress-driven cortisol elevation is worth considering. If you're dealing with poor sleep, elevated resting heart rate, frequent sugar cravings, and feeling wired but tired, that cluster often accompanies chronically elevated stress hormones. Cortisol isn't the only pathway connecting stress to weight gain. Chronic stress disrupts sleep, and poor sleep independently affects hunger hormones in ways that increase appetite. Stress also commonly increases cravings for high-sugar comfort foods, a pattern observed consistently in research on stress eating. Chronic stress can reduce motivation for exercise and create decision fatigue that makes healthy eating harder. So how do you actually lower cortisol naturally? Sleep is one of the most consistently supported factors. Poor sleep quality and insufficient duration are both associated with elevated evening cortisol, so prioritizing 7 to 9 hours of consistent quality sleep is one of the highest leverage changes available. Regular moderate exercise helps regulate cortisol over time, though the relationship with exercise is more nuanced than more is always better. Mindfulness meditation, deep breathing exercises, and time in nature have all shown measurable effects on lowering cortisol in controlled studies. Social connection matters too. People with stronger support networks tend to show lower cortisol reactivity to stress. Here's a point that gets lost in a lot of cortisol content. While regular, moderate exercise generally supports healthy cortisol regulation, excessive high-intensity training without adequate recovery can chronically elevate cortisol rather than lower it. This is part of the physiological picture behind overtraining. For someone already dealing with chronic life stress, adding excessive high-intensity cardio without proper recovery can compound the problem. Mixing in lower intensity activities like walking and mobility work alongside harder sessions tends to support better stress hormone regulation. Nutrition matters too. Chronically restrictive, very low calorie dieting has been shown in some research to elevate cortisol, a somewhat counterintuitive finding for people trying to lose weight through aggressive calorie cutting. Stable blood sugar also matters. A diet built around adequate protein, fiber, and whole foods tends to support more stable blood sugar and a more regulated cortisol pattern. Sleep deserves its own emphasis because the research connecting poor sleep to both elevated cortisol and increased abdominal fat is genuinely strong. If you're addressing only one factor from this entire guide, sleep is the one with the most consistent research backing. How long before you'd actually notice a difference? Sleep-related improvements in cortisol regulation can show up within 1 to 2 weeks of consistently better sleep. Visible changes in body composition operate on a much longer timeline, generally the same 8 to 12 week range you'd expect from any fat loss approach, since fat loss is still governed primarily by sustained calorie balance regardless of how well regulated your stress hormones are. The popularity of this topic has created a market for cortisol-focused supplements and detox products promising targeted belly fat reduction. Most of these products lack meaningful clinical evidence, and no supplement reliably overrides the fundamental role of calorie balance in fat loss. Another common mistake is using "it's just cortisol" as a reason to skip the fundamentals entirely. The most effective approach treats stress management as one piece of a broader strategy, not a replacement for the basic. Since there's no simple test that confirms cortisol belly for an individual, tracking a few practical markers over several weeks is more useful than guessing. Keeping a basic log of sleep duration, subjective stress levels, and any noticeable cravings alongside your waist measurement trends can help you see whether the patterns actually line up. Waist circumference, measured consistently, is generally a more useful tracking metric than scale weight alone when visceral fat specifically is a concern. Overcorrecting into extreme low intensity, only training out of fear of cortisol spikes, is also a mistake for most people. Moderate to vigorous exercise has strong, well-established benefits for both physical and mental health, and for most people without a diagnosed cortisol disorder, the fear of exercise-induced cortisol undermining fat loss is overstated relative to the actual research. If you're experiencing rapid, unexplained weight gain concentrated in your abdomen, face, and upper back, along with symptoms like unusual bruising, purple stretch marks, muscle weakness, or high blood pressure, these can be signs of a genuine cortisol-related condition like Cushing's syndrome and warrant an actual medical evaluation. The cortisol belly fat connection is grounded in real biology, but for most people, it's one contributing factor layered on top of the same fundamentals that drive fat storage everywhere else, not a standalone explanation or a problem you can supplement your way out of. If chronic stress is genuinely part of your picture, prioritizing sleep, moderating rather than maximizing exercise intensity, managing stress through practices with real research support, and maintaining adequate nutrition will do more than any cortisol-branded product